Today, we're going to take a look at the peculiar institution of slavery in this was an institution that you could argue helped to build the country, and it was an institution that almost tore this country about with the Civil War. So we're going to take a look at the workings of the institution, some of the impacts that it's going to have on all those involved, and then lead us closely to the Civil War. This was, again, called a peculiar institution because it was unlike any other type of slavery that had ever existed in the world. This was a system in which the participants, namely the slaves, had no human value whatsoever. They were strictly looked upon as property. And of course, they would participate in one of the most brutal voyages known to man, and that, of course, was the Middle Passage. Slavery had been a part of the culture of America and the economy of America before it became the United States. And as we already know, at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, slavery was kind of built in to our growth. And when I say built in, I'm talking about the word slavery never being mentioned specifically in the Constitution, but as we already know, certain compromises, such as the constitutional, or I should say the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Commercial Compromise, and a couple of others, embedded slavery in our economy and in our daily life. Now, most, not all, most of the founding fathers thought that slavery would die a natural death. Washington, Jefferson, and others believed that, but of course, we know that not to be true. By 1860, of course, 80 years later, cotton had become king, and 90% of Europe's cotton, which means almost all of its industries, were dependent on the South. As you see there, half of all U.S. exports were cotton. And of course, that meant the big money was down south, and that's what, of course, fueled slavery's growth. If you take a look there at some of the states in the South, in South Carolina, as you'll notice, slave population was better than half of what existed there. And of course, in other states, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, or Alabama, it was either more than or almost equal to the population that existed. However, the major trading houses in this slave trade were not located down south. They were located, as you see on the screen, in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. So New England, which was the headquarters or a hotbed for abolitionism, was also responsible for the slave trade. And this was an incongruity that the South often pointed out to them. Now, the trading in human cargo initiated on the west coast of Africa. The coastal kings there, not the people who were making the big money off the slave trade, but the coastal kings would go into the interior, kidnap, as it turns out, close to 20 to 30 million people, bring them to the coast, and then, as you can see in the painting down below, the buyers would come from the ships that were docked off of the coast and proceed to pick up their human cargo for transportation in the Middle Passage. Was there resistance to this? Yes, there was. One successful time would be the HMS Nancy, a British ship on which the slave cargo revolted, killed the crew, and managed to successfully bring the ship around to the East Coast and go back to their homes. But these were few and far between in terms of success rate. Now, the Middle Passage, as you can see, 50% of the cargo died. So if 10 million people were shipped this way, that means 20 million people embarked on that journey. And there along the West Coast, or the slave coast, it was sometimes referred to, these people were transported. decks were put into these ships in order to increase the number of individuals that could be shipped this way. And they were jammed in there in spaces no more than 2 feet in height, and chained and kept that way for a long part of the voyage. Some of the women on there gave birth in that fashion. Many people died in that fashion and were just left there. This was a brutal, brutal thing. Those slaves would later revolt on the ship and wind up in, of all places, Connecticut. And that's where the story really begins.
Cinque must have been an amazing inspiration, a marvelous hero, to have escaped once from enslavement via a mutiny, using a boat that he didn't know anything about, on an ocean he didn't know very much about, and then that he could escape, essentially, from the American legal process that had enslaved African Americans. That's a miracle.
There is no doubt that the outcome would have been different had Cinque attempted a revolt aboard a fully manned transatlantic slave ship.
Now, as we already know, in 1620, so that's between 1617 and 1620, the first Africans arrived in Virginia in chains. Now, were they looked upon as slaves at that point in time? That's debatable. Some people say that they were treated as indentured servants. Others say they immediately were looked upon differently, meaning slavery. But there's no doubt by the mid 1600s, you're going to have slave codes arising in various parts of the South. Georgia's slave code here in 1848, punishment for free persons of color for encouraging slaves, punishment for teaching slaves or free persons of color to read. So this was not only protecting property, but of course this was a racial thing. The American Anti-Slavery Society published these pictures showing the behavior that existed down south, and they directly traced it back to slavery. A region of lynchings, duels, brawls, every evil that you could possibly imagine, and again, as a direct result of slavery.
In the early 1800s, the Southern economy depended upon slave labor to work the plantations. In the 1820s, major slave concentrations existed in South Carolina and inland Georgia. As the cotton industry grew, so did slave labor. By 1860, the major concentrations ranged from Virginia, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. The barbaric treatment of slaves led many to rebel and escape. The Underground Railroad transported slaves to such free states as Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and as far north as Canada.
Now, we all know that cotton became king as a result of Eli Whitney's invention. And again, this was not something that Whitney had intended when he helped his poor aunt down in South Carolina. However, the cotton gin did much to perpetuate slavery in the South. And again, the number of slaves, as you see there, from 730,000 to 5 million. Cotton, again, brought great wealth, but that wealth was not in cash. It was not liquid. It was tied up in property. And that property, of course, was the slaves. 4 million slaves out of 33 million people in the United States by the 1840s. And what it was going to result in is what some people refer to as a feudal system, what in India today is sometimes referred to as a caste system, which made it very difficult to travel from one level to another. If you could not afford slaves, did not own a lot of slaves, then you couldn't get up to the next level. And that's the way that society pretty much stayed. It was not a fluid, ever-changing society, much different from the one that was now growing up in both the North and the West. The internal slave trade, as a result of the outlawing of the external slave trade, according to the Constitution, became big business. Virginia was called the Queen of the Slave States, and that because her soil had been exhausted through the growth of both tobacco and cotton in many areas. And so it took the slaves, and if you will, it would breed the slaves and then sell them into the deep South, into the area that would later become known as the Black Belt because of its rich soil. And that would extend all the way into Texas. Now, were there slave revolts? Yes, throughout the South they occurred. We have already discussed perhaps the most famous one, and that, of course, was Nat Turner's revolt. But there were other abortive revolts, Gabriel Prosser in Virginia, Denmark Vesey's in Charleston, and the New Orleans one. But the bloodiest and the most famous was Nat Turner's, again, resulting in the death of 45 whites, men, women, and children, and the execution of over 100 slaves, many of whom had nothing to do with the revolt. But this just further ensconced in the South's mind the danger of setting slaves free, and of course they blamed the North for interfering in their peculiar institution. Amistad, which becomes a revolt against slave, but also becomes a cause célèbre because of what happens in the court system. And it's the American court system that's going to slightly change the course of history in this area. Involved very much in the Amistad case would be various and sundry abolitionists. The abolitionist movement reached its nadir in the time that we talked about before concerning reform in America during the Jacksonian period. Now, it had already existed prior to that, but with the coming of the Second Great Awakening and the growth of various and sundry reform movements, the abolitionist movement grew stronger and bigger than any of those. The people that you see pictured here, some of which we've talked about already, namely the Grimke sisters and Harriet Tubman. Frederick Douglass himself, an escaped slave, would go overseas and become an international celebrity. He would eventually be lured back to the United States by William Lloyd Garrison, who was a newspaper editor, and the two of them would join forces for some time period and publish The Liberator. Horace Greeley, an extremely influential newspaper editor and an abolitionist during the time of the Civil War. Sojourner Truth, we'll talk about in a bit. Harriet Stowe becomes one of the best-selling authors of all time because of her book, which we'll talk about later on. Now, again, they see the slavery as an immoral institution. Again, the religious background and the religious roots of this argument. Others, all men are created equal, Declaration of Independence. And this was something that Abraham Lincoln greatly stressed during this time period. But the man that you see pictured in the upper left-hand corner, Elijah Lovejoy, in certain respects, becomes bigger than all of them. Lovejoy, like some others, was a newspaper editor, an abolitionist newspaper editor, headquartered in Missouri. But Missouri being a slave state, obviously he was not going to be welcome there. So he moved his operation across state lines into Illinois. Now, Illinois, a free state, but Illinois was not tolerant of abolitionists. So eventually, what's going to happen as he prints his newspaper is going to be burnt to the ground.
Oh, what a nasty bullet wound.
And eventually, so will his house. Over 100 and some pro-slavers will surround his house, ask him to come out. He will not. He will have the house burned down around him, and then he will be shot and killed. And in so doing, he becomes more important than the other abolitionists that I mentioned, because he will become bigger in death than he was in life. He is now a martyr for the cause. And again, this served to underline in many people's minds the violence that was automatically associated with slavery. The man you see pictured here, of course, is William Lloyd Garrison. His newspaper, The Liberator, would have enormous impact throughout the country. It was published in Boston, which was kind of the capital, if you will, of the abolitionist newspaper, or the abolitionist movement. He is going to have a falling out with Frederick Douglass. Garrison believed that the South should just be allowed to go and separate from America. He also was not necessarily in favor of violence to secure the rights of Black Americans. That was not the belief of Frederick Douglass. He wanted freedom, and he wanted it now, and he wanted equality, and he wanted it immediately. And that was not necessarily Garrison. Keep in mind that all abolitionists, matter of fact, the great majority of them, did not believe in equality. They believed in the end of the institution, but not necessarily believe in equality. Now, with the growth of the slave trade, the internal slave trade, you're also going to have the growth of what becomes known as the Underground Railroad. And we all know that it was not underground and it was not a railroad, but various routes of escape, allowing somewhere in the neighborhood of 40,000 slaves, 300 of them alone, escorted by Harriet Tubman. They would go to various parts of the North, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and a great number of them would go and be shepherded all the way into Canada by some of the quote-unquote conductors of the railroad. This would grow and be a thorn in the side of the South. But there were other ways to gain one's freedom. The man that you see pictured in this cartoon is Henry Box Jones. Henry Box Brown. He mailed himself to freedom. He put himself in a box, fastened down the top, and was mailed to Philadelphia, where he maintained and kept his freedom for the rest of his natural-born life. But there were others who fought in a different way. Frances Watkins Harper. She will publish a poem, Blood Transformed into Gold, and she will be the first African-American woman to have short stories published. She would later on, as you see there on the screen, foreshadow Rosa Parks, because in 1849 in Philadelphia, she refuses to go to the back of a trolley car that was transversing the streets of Philadelphia. And 100 years later, of course, that's exactly what Rosa Parks is going to do in the Montgomery bus boycott.
Squeezed into the cramped hold of a slave ship, the African captive named Singbe PA couldn't have known that he would really have an opportunity to return to his homeland. What Singbe was about to attempt had never been accomplished in the brutal history of the transatlantic slave trade. Yet his actions would capture the attention of an entire nation.
Now, if you have not seen Amistad, it's something you definitely want to take some time to watch. For the most part, it's historically accurate, except the very end. There is no proof that Cinque, the leader of the slave revolt, when he went back to Africa, there is some stories that abound that he could not find his wife and his children, but that he himself also got involved in the slave trade. Now, again, the proof on that is sketchy, but nonetheless, it becomes a lesson in the American legal system. So we've taken a look at a brief look at the slave trade and this institution, the peculiar institution. Next, we will take a look at Manifest Destiny and its impact on the coming Civil War.